Students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is the court packing plan. And here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. Let's start by reviewing the idea of checks and balances. There are three branches in the federal government: the executive, which is the president, the legislative, which includes Congress, and the judicial, which includes federal courts, including the Supreme Court. Checks and balances refers to the ability of one of these branches to limit the power of the other two. And the goal of checks and balances is to prevent any one branch of government from having too much power. Take a look at the image, which shows some of the ways that the branches can check or limit the other two. Let's look first at the executive branch, which is the president, and the judicial branch, which includes the Supreme Court. There are 9 judges on the Supreme Court who get to serve for their entire life. But if one of them dies or decides to retire, the president at the time gets to appoint a new one. That gives the president some power over the Supreme Court, because he or she can appoint someone who shares their same political views. For example, a president who is an economic liberal could appoint a new Supreme Court judge who is also an economic liberal. So the president has some influence over the Supreme Court. On the other hand, the federal courts also have some power over the president because they can declare presidential acts called executive orders unconstitutional. For example, in 2017, a federal court ruled that Donald Trump's executive order denying government money to sanctuary cities was unconstitutional. So the courts have the ability to limit the power of the president as well. Now let's look at checks between the judicial branch and the legislative branch. The legislative branch passes laws, but just as the judicial branch can declare a presidential act unconstitutional, it can also declare a law passed by Congress to be unconstitutional. And the ability of the Supreme Court to declare executive orders and congressional laws unconstitutional is called judicial review. Okay, let's go back to the 1930s and the New Deal. FDR was first elected in 1932, and he set about implementing the first New Deal. In 1936, he was elected again in another landslide victory, and his party, the Democrats, controlled 2 of the 3 branches of the federal government. FDR was the president, and Democrats had a majority in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate, which are the 2 houses of the legislative branch. So the Democrats had a lot of power. What they did not have power over was the Supreme Court. Of the 9 members of the Supreme Court in 1936, 4 were conservatives who opposed the New Deal, and a 5th was a moderate who often voted with the conservatives. And that meant that a majority, 5 of the 9 judges, did not agree with FDR's plans. And the result was that the Supreme Court kept declaring the New Deal laws passed by Congress unconstitutional. For example, Congress passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act in 1932, which paid farmers not to grow crops. But the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. For FDR, this was very frustrating. He wanted to find a way to implement his New Deal policies without the Supreme Court stopping him. And his solution was called the court packing plan. FDR asked Congress to pass a new law that would allow him to increase the size of the Supreme Court from 9 judges to 15 judges. And that way, he wouldn't have to wait for the judges to die or retire before he could appoint new ones. As soon as the law was passed, he would be able to add 6 new judges quickly. FDR hoped that by adding liberal judges, he would change the balance of the Supreme Court so that the conservatives would no longer have a majority, and as a result, they would no longer be able to declare the New Deal laws unconstitutional. FDR is one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history, but there are 2 things that he's widely criticized for. One of them you're going to learn about in the next lesson, and the other is the court packing plan. While some people agreed with FDR that the court packing plan was necessary to achieve the New Deal, most Americans disagreed, seeing the court packing plan as a sneaky way for FDR to get around the system of checks and balances. They believed that he was gaining too much power and becoming a dictator. All right, it's time to review the objectives. If you don't know the answer to any of them, just rewind the video and look again. And I will see you in class. Bye, students.